Okay.
Is that like a thing you have to switch from to be good at math?
So,
Then I should be.
what if I would do this?
Yeah, no, that's what.
If I would take 5 times some function, what would that do to the graph of your original parent function?
Shrink it.
Change the rate.
Shrink it by
Here's
1/5.
the different things. Like what?
Shrink it by 1/5.
Shrink it by 1/5. Can you go give me a little more detail? What do you mean by shrink it, I guess?
It's get like
You can give me a specific example if you want.
like just thought of like cosine or like how like the like not like I forgot the word now. Yeah, period change shrinks by 1/5.
Period would not change
Like
on the
your-
cosine function if I took 5 times the cosine.
Like your rate of change would, like,
It gets steeper.
it'd get steeper. Like, it
The
would.
rate of
oh,
change,
yeah,
the slope or something would get steeper.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, Bailey?
It gets narrower.
Gets narrower.
Like if it's a parabola.
Like if it's a parabola,
It would.
it would be a very skinny, narrow parabola now. Okay, anybody else? Thoughts? Feel good about their answers? Okay? No, that's good. Very good.
Said mine.
Okay? What's that, Bert?
That already said mine.
Okay, well good. So when you take the function and you multiply it by a number, and specifically by a number that's larger than 1, has to be larger than 1, okay, it's going to take the graph and make it steeper, make it narrower, make it increase faster. And the way you're going to write that, so we're consistent, okay, is we're going to say it stretches it vertically by a factor of 5. That's what I want you to write. Is going to stretch f of x vertically by a factor of 5. Yes, Derek?
What if it was a negative number?
We'll get into negatives later.
Okay.
It's going to reflect it, but yes. It's going to reflect it and then stretch it,
Yeah.
which we get into all those combinations later on. Yep. Okay. So, to make it in general then, if c is greater than 1, c times f of x will stretch f of x vertically by a factor of c. That's kind of the in general rule, all right? If you think about it with a parabola, so you got this x squared right here, okay? So I got this parabola, y equals x squared. If I put a 5 in front of that, it's like you're going to take the tops of my fingers and stretch them vertically. So if you pull on my fingers up, all right, you're stretching it vertically, it's going to make it narrower. Okay? It's going to make it narrower. Well, that's why we say stretch it vertically. Okay? So you take this parabola, and I'm pulling on it vertically by a factor of 5, it's going to make it a very narrow parabola. Okay? What if c is between 0 and 1? It's going to get wider, right? If this was like 1/4 x squared, okay, so here's x squared, 1/4 x squared, it's not going to grow as fast. The rate of change will be slower, so it gets wider, okay? So instead of stretching it vertically, I'm shrinking it vertically, okay? Is this hand stuff helping, or I just look like a moron up here?
Stretch it like horizontal.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a different way. If c is between 0 and 1, then c times f of x would shrink f of x vertically by a factor of c. Some of you might be thinking about, okay, now you're going to ask me to graph these without a calculator by shrinking them or stretching them vertically, okay? I'm really not picky at all. You don't have to do that very often, but if you do have to do this on a sketch without a calculator, all you do is you just make it obvious, all right? If it's supposed to be stretched vertically, if it's supposed to be steeper, just make sure you draw it a little bit steeper. Okay, it doesn't need to be exactly steeper. If you want to make a table of values, make a table of values, that's fine. But most of the time, questions involving stretching and shrinking vertically will be more word questions. Okay? I just ask you to describe it, not actually graph it. Alright? Okay, so any questions on that? Okay? Now, there's a difference between this and this. If I'm going to refer back to my x squared, that would be like saying there's this, f of x equals 3x squared. What would the 3 in front of the x squared do to the parent function?
Make it 3 times bigger.
Make it steeper, but to use the vocabulary we just got done talking about, stretch it vertically by a factor of 3. Okay? That is different than this.
Because it's squaring the 3 too.
Okay? If you say that is stretched vertically by a factor of 9, I can't count that wrong. You're right. Okay? Because 3x times itself is 9x squared. So you could write it as just 9x squared. And therefore then it is stretched vertically by a factor of 9. Okay? However, what we will say is, now we're going to talk about a horizontal stretch or shrink. Okay? But what we're going to say then is this is going to be shrunk horizontally by a factor of 3. Okay? So horizontally is side to side. If you take something and you do this to it, that's going to shrink it horizontally. It's also going to make it steeper if you think of it that way, just like Jake's saying. But it's not going to be by a factor of 3. It would end up being by a factor of 9. You had to do a little bit of math to figure that out.
So we could just stick with stretching it.
Vertically?
Yeah. You could just say always stretch it vertically, just different numbers.
This necessarily doesn't matter if like line like y equals x. Right?
Not always.
That changes the period, right?
That would shrink it horizontally. Wouldn't really change the amplitude. I mean, yeah, between each one, you might say it's a little bit steeper in a sense, but how much steeper? So that's why I don't want you to always think you can go back to vertically. Okay? This would be shrunk horizontally by a factor of 4. All right? Where this would be stretched vertically by a factor of 4. Because this would change the amplitude, this one changes the period. Okay? So this would shrink f of x horizontally by a factor of c. by the way, that's if C is greater than 1. If C is between 0 and 1, instead of shrinking it horizontally, it's going to stretch it horizontally. Okay?
Are we gonna get test questions at, like you ask us to explain it like this?
Yes. I'll try and do one here in a second, Blake, after we get this done. One thing I think you can do to help you remember which one's going to be vertically and which one's going to be horizontally, when you think about shifting something left or right, shifting it left or right, doesn't that plus or minus need to be inside the parentheses? Same thing with stretching or shrinking it horizontally. It has to be inside the parentheses, that extra number that you're including. Where if it's outside the parentheses, or not within the function itself, that's going to affect a vertical shrink. Or
Are we gonna talk about division too, or is it just multiplication?
essentially, we are talking about division when I give you this right here. Because divided by 4 would be like multiplying by 1/4, so then we're talking right in here. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So, type of problem. Describe transformation.